Thank you. Thank you for that really warm introduction, Nathan. In fact, before we came on here, we were trading stories from the early Wired days when he was at Vivid, and we were at South of Market, and it's getting to be now 20 years ago, which is getting to be a little too long. But it's been a long story here. Now, it's great to be with you guys here. It's a conversation with folks that are all about innovation, folks that you don't have to explain to them kind of the big challenges that are going on in this society. Often I'm outside the Bay Area doing talks around the country, and occasionally outside the country, and you got to start with the basics of climate change, or you have to start with the basics of the digital revolution and things like that. So I'm going to really be talking on a much higher plane with you folks so we can get to some really interesting parts of the conversation, I think. So what I'm going to do today, you see here this reconstructed Statue of Liberty, is I'm going to be talking about this concept of reinvention. You talk about your innovation space. I think of it as reinvention, or the space I'm really interested in is reinvention. Really fundamental system change. How do you take systems that were designed and worked in the 20th century and move them into the 21st? And that's something that I think this country is poised to be explosion of innovation around this, I think, in the next 10, 20 years. And I'm going to make that case for you here. So when we're talking about innovation like that, a reinvention like that, you have to start with a little bit of a context that here we are in the election season. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the context of what's really going on in this election, I would say, without getting too partisan or too kind of into the politics of it. I want to frame it as in regards of how it fits into this larger reinvention of the country. And then I'm going to talk about reinvention in more historical context, how it's happened in this country and how I expect it's going to happen in the next 10, 20 years. And then I'm going to do, this is the third thing, since you're MBA students, you folks are all interested in businesses, I'm going to talk about my latest business, which is called Reinventors. Comes right out of this reinvention idea. And it's actually a new startup. We just got incorporated. We literally just got the paperwork back from the state of California, incorporated today. Or over the weekend. I got it Saturday. And so it's about as new as you can get here. We just got some investment from the Valley, and I'll talk about that in relation to this all today too. So we got a nice setup here for talking, and let's start into it here. Now, one of the things I'm going to do, and I always do when I do these talks, when I think about, I like to just get out of the day-to-day, the kind of timing here. You know, we're kind of so used to this kind of tweet time. Everything's moving so fast, bing, 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 bing. We occasionally get a little time, maybe we step back into kind of a weekly kind of rhythm of news and what's happening, take a little breather on the weekends once in a while. Then when I talk to a lot of businesses, they at least take a breather, put their heads out of the weeds a little bit once every 3 months or so. Occasionally with elections now, we get a little, this is what passes for long-term thinking in terms of our country is, hey, let's take 4 years and take a look around what happened in 4 years, what's going to happen potentially in the next 4. But this talk is going to be talking at a different wavelength. We're going to be talking at kind of almost national history, a different, longer wave thing, and even at the level of world history. And I don't want to be too hyperbolic here, but I think we're really living in a time of really world historical significance and certainly national significance. And I'm going to get the kind of just that coming up here. So when you think about it at that level, when you pull the lens way back into this more national history, kind of global, world history kind of point of view, and look in our moment in history here, the politics, a lot of the kind of busy kind of, oh my God, jobs report came out today, and oh my God, the polls are, this way, 2 points up in Florida. All that stuff just kind of falls away. And although there is a way to kind of analyze the election and think about those kind of things, and it excites me, it's something I'm interested in too, what's really much more interesting is the essence of really when all that stuff falls away, what's really going on in this election. And I think my kind of way, I got a couple ways to think about that. Now, the way most people, think, if we think of the big picture, in historic kind of terms, what happened with the Obama election? We say, well, gosh, we're in this kind of incredible downturn that was the biggest kind of drop in the economy since, the Great Depression. And since that point, Obama's kind of making the case that he's been trying to pull this economy up out of this incredible crater that was in. And there's a good case to be made, and that's actually, I think, bears kind of thinking about. People are saying, well, why aren't we back booming? Well, because we came out of this crater, and my God, this is 4 million jobs. There's other ways to kind of look. If you look at his first, term, comparing him historically, I mean, there's been 45 presidents now. most presidents are lousy. Most 4-year cycles are like, nobody gets much accomplished. And so I would say in historic terms, that's a pretty good first term. And most really great presidents take about 8 years, and it's their second 4 years that really kick in. So I think there's an argument to be made with a bigger picture lens on what's going on there. But that's not the way I'm going to even talk about this now either. I think what's really going on here is it really is a choice that we haven't seen in a generation. Obama's making that case. Pundits have been starting to make it, and I think there's something to it. But I have it with a twist. And the twist is this, is that when Obama talks about this once-a-generation call, he's thinking that the last time the country made essentially a generational call was essentially the election of Ronald Reagan, where you essentially came off about a 30 or 40-year run of liberal democratic kind of running in the country, and you made a fundamental change into a kind of conservative kind of view of how you'd run that economy. Much more smaller government idea, free market thing, cut regulations, cut taxes, try that. And that was a big shift, and it really did define the politics of this country for the last 30 years or so. He's kind of teeing it up thinking that, and he's often talked about Reagan as a kind of a historic character. There is something to that, but I'm going to think even bigger here in a minute here. There is essentially a rhythm in American politics from that big picture historical point of view that essentially is there's this essentially two ways to think of the two sides of American politics. Don't think about it in party terms per se. Think of it, there's a conservative kind of pull in politics and there's a progressive pull. Not progressive in the way you think of San Francisco progressives right now. But there's a generic way to think about what this is. I mean, just think of the word progressive. It's usually progress. Conservative is more conserve. It's kind of more forward thinking. Let's innovate. And there's a kind of, hey, well, let's look back to what worked in the past. There's a kind of, again, an innovative kind of spirit a lot of times. Let's try new stuff. There tends to be, hey, let's preserve the best stuff, go back to the Constitution, that kind of stuff. And ultimately, I would say these periods of reinvention, which we're going to talk about, are generated usually in progressive kind of eras. And ultimately, you have reactions off that are usually fighting, kicking, and screaming from the conservative side. So what's happened in American history is this thing has happened over and over and over again. It tends to happen that the conservative side of things tends to actually be those that have a lot, and often it's people with a lot of money, tend to want to hang on to what's going on. And those that don't have much and want to bet on the future move towards the progressive side. So you constantly get this situation of this 1% and 9%. This is the kind of language of we saw last year in the Occupy Wall Street thing, but there's something to it, and this has happened over again in history. Now, if you take that, what's going on in terms of how parties have done this, it isn't always Democrats, it isn't always the Republicans on one side and the Democrats on the other. The Republicans have the biggest progressive Republicans or Americans in history have been actually Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt. Progressive presidencies radically changed the country. And in fact, the bad guys, the conservatives at that time, were the Democrats, hanging on to slavery, for God's sakes. I mean, it was, but you could say in terms of current politics in the last generation, there was essentially a different kind of progressives were on the Democratic Party, and we've actually seen the conservatives kind of capture more the sense of the conservative side. So when you see this election, this is essentially, we are getting this, we're seeing this thing now. This is kind of an obvious thing, but what I'm trying to say is don't just think of it think of it as how the real fundamentals of what's going on. This is the juncture. This is the big choice. This is the thing that basically Obama's been trying to talk about. Yeah, there's specifics to the policies, but essentially it's a way forward. It's essentially what they're trying to figure out is which direction are we going to go, which is the country. Is the country at one of these cusps? Now, you could say the conservatives have essentially over those 30 years kind of come up with a set of ideas, and they are doubling down on those kind of ideas. And we saw that basically with, here we are. Yeah, Romney. Romney's essentially doubled down with this essentially way that we've been doing it for 30 years. What started with Reagan, kept going with Bush, and in fact, he's still there too. And he's also kind of personifies that 1%, which is kind of difficult for him right now. With his money in the Cayman Islands, all that kind of stuff. And what we've kind of seen is, Obama's trying to push the other direction. Now, he's trying to say, let's use useful government. Let's try to innovate forward a little bit. Let's bring everybody around. So that's kind of the choice we're seeing. Now, I would say And there's all kinds of ways to analyze it in conventional ways. I think he's going to win. I think he's going to win substantially, much more than people think. I think there's going to be a lot of down ballot kind of shift too. And I think you're going to basically see a sense coming out of selection of a choice beginning to be made. It won't be the final choice. There'll be other runs at this. But I think we're actually seeing this kind of, in a historical point of view, there's something moving away from this conservative thing of the last 30 years. That's one way to think about what's going on historically. Pull back the lens even further, and that's where we get into this reinvention kind of space here. There is a bigger thing going on here. And it's not just about this yin-yang of conservative, progressive, kind of who's controlling the politics, although it's part of that. There's a bigger thing that's going on here, is that the country has gone through, I would argue, 4 fundamental reinventions. Fundamental reinventions, which has essentially been an explosion of innovation that's lasted about 10, 20 years, where we essentially reinvented what it was to be America, how the economy worked, how society worked, how a government worked. And we saw this about 4 times, and I'm arguing we're in our 5th. We're just about to enter the 5th. Now, how does this thing work? If you look at it in the past, 2 fundamental things have always prefaced these explosions of reinvention. One is you get such deep structural changes in the fabric of the economy, like you go from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, that kind of level of structural change going on. Or you go from rural living to urban living. I mean, we're talking deep structural change in the countries to the point that the systems of that old thing that worked in the agricultural or rural living just don't work in this new environment. You have to reinvent on a fundamental level. That's one thing that always shows up. The second thing is the country faces unprecedented challenges, something that the other systems of the old past they didn't know how to deal with, like nuclear war was the last one we really dealt with. We're like, oh my God. It was just something so out of our world view, you had to really go back to the drawing board of doing it. Every era has had its version of that. Now that 2 double bursts have essentially created these 4 periods of innovation. There was one around the election of 1800 with Thomas Jefferson, was called the Revolution of 1800. We don't kind of remember history that far back, but it was an incredible shift in power. It was much more democratized government and much more decentralized government and much more kind of decentralized economy. It was essentially a period of much more democratized period of America that lasted about 10, 20 years of reinvention, and it lasted the basis of the Civil War. There was another reinvention at the Civil War, and we think, okay, Abraham Lincoln, get it, he ended slavery. Go back to history books, tons of other stuff. They essentially opened up the whole country with the Transcontinental Railroad. They opened up the West with the Homestead Act. They basically started land-grant universities to democratize education, higher education. Tons of things happened. An explosion in about 10 or 12 years. Crazy amount of innovation that went. They essentially invented the system and lasted for 50 years. The other one was essentially around 1900. You saw the beginning of the progressive era, Teddy Roosevelt, and then it ended with Woodrow Wilson. Crazy level of experimentation. I'm going to go into that a little bit more here, just a little more detail. And essentially the last one we saw of this scale was FDR and what came out of the Great Depression, World War II. And essentially the building of the post-war world. And that world we're still living in here, folks. And it's those systems that are breaking down fundamentally, and that's what needs the reinvention today. This level of history is not Reagan level of history. This is Mount Rushmore. These 3 are Mount Rushmore. And the only reason FDR isn't on Mount Rushmore is because it was built in the 30s, basically, when he was still around. So, but this is the level we're talking about. And this is the level, I would say, and I don't want to be too hyperbolic, but, start to think, I mean, it seems crazy, but I'm saying if he lives up to it, he might not. And again, I don't want to get too into it here, but I'm saying think on that level. That's the level of reinvention. Is that the beginning of an era that actually has that scale? Maybe he's not the guy. Maybe it'll be the next time it'll come. Maybe who knows? Maybe there's a Romney thing. But in my opinion, it has to be something really fundamental. I would argue this is it. Now, to understand this a little bit more, the fabric of how this works, I want to go to the last time we were at this level of transformation. And that was essentially in 1900. Think about the early part of the 20th century. You had essentially the industrialization of the country from an agricultural economy. You had this massive influx of people into the cities. The cities were overwhelmed. They didn't have sanitation. They didn't have all kinds of stuff. It was just craziness in the cities. You had incredible problems going on there. In fact, if you go back to their challenges here, in fact, I kind of just mentioned that, you had a very similar thing. You had this 1% crew. This was controlling the economy. It was all kind of out of whack. There was this whole sense, again, of these cities couldn't organize themselves, couldn't keep basic health care going, basic kind of organization going, and it was completely corrupted government. So when we kind of compare ourselves now, we think, oh God, we got problems. I mean, there was a kind of a similar feeling back then. But what happened, really interestingly enough, and this is that one period I just mentioned, the period that started with Teddy Roosevelt, but this is the class of what they literally call it the progressive era, and that was started with a Republican, Teddy Roosevelt, ended with Woodrow Wilson. And in the space of about 15 to 20 years, it was an incredible explosion of innovation. I'll just mention a few of them. I mean, they completely took on the robber barons, busted into pieces, Standard Oil, all that kind of stuff just went boom. They basically, for the first time, put in an income tax, which had never been in there. They basically built all these food and safety things, all the meat packing stuff. I mean, you know, get children out of, you know, the factories, all that kind of stuff. Gave women the right to vote. I mean, hey, you know, they hadn't been able to vote. And ultimately, they did this whole thing on environment, too, at the beginning of the national parks and all this. Again, the reason I'm trying to say this is you can go from these incredibly overwhelming periods of kind of just, oh my God, how are we ever going to solve this, to a burst of innovation that essentially set up things that we're still living with today. So if you look today and apply that kind of lens, that historic lens of what's going on in this country, what's going on today? Well, we are going through essentially the biggest technology transformation. It blows away what was going on in the early 20th century, basically. I mean, they were electrifying everything. They were kind of coming up with telephones. They were coming up with, you know, basic kind of the combustible engine, you know, kind of for cars and autos like that. I mean, those are big deals. I don't want to downplay them. But we are now in a thing that this is probably the most profound and radical and dramatic transformation of technology in a concentrated period of time the country's ever been through. And it has profound consequences, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. The second thing is, this is the globalization of everything. This is the first time in the history of the planet all systems are going global. All these boundaries that used to be defined forever by nations or cities or whatever it is are just getting obliterated by this reorganization at the global level. This is something that's world historic. This is something that people in 50 or 100 or 200 years' time, they'll say, early 21st century. The world went digital, the world went global. That's already in motion. The third thing, though, is we're up against an unprecedented challenge. And this, you know, the main one being climate change right now. But there's also a series, which I don't have to convince you folks of, but there's a series of system breakdowns that are going on right now that essentially are, I would say, very emblematic of this breakdown of 20th century systems that can't work in the 21st century, this digital, globally connected 21st century. And so you're watching, you know, oh my God, the healthcare isn't working. Oh my God, the educational system isn't working. Oh my God, we don't have the Social Security ain't working. Baby boom retirement. I mean, all these issues. You just go around the table about these. This is emblematic of system breakdown. And you have to figure out ways to reinvent all these systems to work in the 21st. That's the challenge we're in. So whatever you think about, whether you like change or not like change, or hey, I like innovation or not, this is a crew that probably loves it. Man, we are in a time of reinvention. I mean, this is what your careers are going to be. I mean, you're all starting your careers now. Hang on for the ride, folks. It's going to be 10, 20 years of explosive innovation, and ultimately it'll keep going to mid-century. This is a big, big transformation we're in. We're basically going from a world that was literally an analog world to a completely digital world. Everything will be digital and tied into these computers and connected up. We're only in the beginning of that thing, and it's just going to keep going. We're going from a system that was, again, organized as these nation kind of states, and it is all systems are going global. We're in about kind of a third to halfway through that right now. A lot more to come. And then ultimately, this is the one that in the Bay Area how we're the least mature of. But we got to reinvent everything. We got to redesign. If you folks are MBAs in design, we got to design everything that worked in this world to work in this world. And this is going to be the great challenges. This is the one I'm the most fearful of. The other two are going to happen. This one, all bets are still out. And so the basic kind of catch-all way to think of it is we're finally going from 20th century to 21st. And that is, again, essentially the arc of your careers. Now, what I'm going to do is just take each of those three little areas and talk a little bit about the digitization of everything, globalization of everything, and this sustainable thing. And then I'm going to move into a little bit of my company that comes out of this. We got some time here, but I don't, you know, you folks get the basics of the digital revolution and all that, so I'm not going to talk to you the way I talk to other kind of crew. I'm going to talk at a pretty sophisticated level here. But there's a few developments in this space that I think you really got to tune into that a lot of people who think they know what's going on here are underestimating. And I think it has a lot of impact on innovation, frankly, that I want to talk to you about. One is this digital revolution has a lot lot of running room in front of it here, folks. As much as we think it's really changed our lives, and it has, it's just kind of mid-stride right now. It's starting to get going. I'll give you one example that just kind of throws it kind of in perspective. It's like if you go back into the 70s, basically the first personal computer started basically late 70s, right? That was the kind of Apple II computer was basically 78, 79, I think. We probably remember this, but maybe you guys don't. But basically, that was the beginning of the personal computer era, say, is late 70s, 78, 79. 80 is roughly to think about it. The fastest, the most powerful supercomputers at that time were essentially measured, in, still to this day, you're measured by megaflops, essentially, 150 megaflops, but it cost you about 31 million bucks, and that is it. That's the size of it, and you had these kind of guys running around kind of geeking out on it, right? The iPad 2 is faster than that, and it costs basically 500 bucks, and that chip was flipped into the iPhone 4S, and essentially you can get it for 199 bucks. So essentially what we've seen in basically the 30 years of Moore's Law and the digital revolution is essentially these things are become $31 million supercomputers, right? And there's a lot more running room going on here in this kind of doubling in power every 2 years and all the kind of shrinking of power, dropping of price. And this is basically going to play out another 10 years or so. So anyhow, there's a lot of kind of just, oh my God, this thing is still kind of chugging and it's still starting to move through all these different tools. One piece just to kind of give us perspective. Jobs, everyone's been kind of talking, you know, giving him his homage, and he should, as he should. But his legacy, many different legacies, but the legacy I want to basically point out to you, which is one I think is underappreciated, is this idea of opening the door to video. Is what he started to do, particularly with his FaceTime on this iPhone, was essentially to open up these video channel possibilities. Easy of use, kind of opening video channels between the phones, something that people hadn't really been regularly thinking about in terms of phone. And in fact, what happened is in every one of these products, boom, 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 they're all now embedded with these cameras. And now all, because Apple is always ahead of the game, all the devices essentially are shot through with these things now. So now you've got a built-in infrastructure of all these digital cameras baked into every single digital appliance going on from now and forever, right? Interesting point one. Well, you start to think, why is that important? Well, one way to think about that is, let me just kind of hide here for 1 second, and you can go, this is what you do if I was tapping this out with my thumbs on my iPhone, right? This is how fast you'd basically be hearing me, you know, doing this whole thing, right? In other words, we've basically spent a million years figuring out how to communicate subtly, with power, with emotion, with kind of drama through our faces. And we've spent about, whatever, maybe 10 years figuring out how to do it with our thumbs. I'll tell you, we are a lot better at this thing. I mean, the amount of kind of information you can move through video and through just looking at someone is huge compared to what you can do in this. And essentially what's happening is the digital age is going now from textual digital age to essentially a video digital age. And that is a huge, huge shift. And it's going to have a lot of big repercussions. And that brings up the next down generational kind of crew of innovators here, the Google guys. And I want to focus on the one thing that they're really doing that's really interesting here, is essentially around video. So the big problem with digital information was essentially that's the amount of information it takes to go with text, that's an image, that's video. Video is huge. A lot of information gets moved, but you need a lot to actually move it, right? So we had to wait for this incredible shift, which was agonizing for those of us in the early days of the 90s here, of the shift of the building of the pipes. But essentially, if you think of the entire digital revolution of the last 2 years, or last 20 years, sorry, there's been essentially the low bandwidth internet boom in the 90s, of which we talked about from Wired in those vivid days. Anything to do that could come across that low bandwidth internet, text and photo, did so, and disrupted everything around that, including newspapers. What took is you needed essentially this pause. There's a little bit of the dot-com crash, but part of it was also keeping building the pipes out. And then the next big files that came through were the audio files. Who got hit next? The music industry, Napster and all that. The next biggest files, television file or video files. Who got hit next? YouTube hit basically television. And only now with Netflix and others, we're starting to get basically the film industry getting disrupted. 20 years it took, building out the pipes. Ultimately, the whole place went digital. That's essentially, in a nutshell, what happened. Now, though, what's interesting is if you look This is kind of a geeky one, but it's worth here to watch here. This is essentially the traffic on the backbone of the internet from that same period, 1990 to 2010, basically the last 20 years. And in the early days, this is the percentage of traffic, right? So for example, the web didn't exist in the early 90s in our day. And so there's no percentage. And then it kind of built to about 2000, about half of all web traffic was essentially the web, right? And FTP, do you guys remember that thing? You probably don't. But anyhow, that was a big deal. Emails kind of hung in there as a little bit. Peer-to-peer. Anyhow, this is the story I want to tell. What happened here? 2005, you basically get YouTube. And look what happened. By 2010, half of all traffic on the backbone of the internet was already video. Half of it. 2010. What's really interesting is Cisco, of all people who does all the routers on the internet, they've now predicted that by 2015, just a few years ahead here, 90% of all traffic on the internet is going to be video. Basically, now these are huge files, so that's why they're taking up a big chunk. And that doesn't mean the web will go away to nothing. There'll still be a lot going on the web, as rich as it is. But the percentage, the bulk of really where all this information is moving into video. And so as you got to start thinking, interesting. What's going to happen when that happens? Now, meanwhile, just a couple numbers here. Just people get this, but it's it's just listen to the numbers. I mean, some people don't really understand. You understand that YouTube's a big deal, but YouTube did not exist in 2005, right? It was just formed, right? And when it was first starting to go, you'd have maybe 8 million views there, right? And when it first launched out. Today, basically, every single day, 4 billion videos. 4 billion videos. There's only about 7 billion people on the planet. 4 billion of them go out every day on YouTube. Now, somebody's watching more than one, and you guys might be doing that. But the idea is just an extraordinary number there. And if you flip it around to actually uploads, again, the same thing happening. We're already seeing 48 hours of video going up every minute. And to put that in context, more video goes up in 30 days on YouTube than all the TV networks produced in all the different, in 60 years. I mean, and it's going, and that's only one video site. And it's going up. So again, I'm just trying to kind of get a little texture of where this is happening. Skype, this is the next thing is the two-way. Well, what's going to happen with Skype? Well, we watched all the way to 2010. By 2010, it was already up to 500 million people doing Skype. And now what's happening, and this is a big shift and something that my company is actually really involved with here. Group video. Apple started, their offering was essentially this FaceTime, you can get up to 4 people. Skype, with a premium account, you now get up to 10 people on that. And Google Hangouts are now up to 10. This is follow the money in Silicon Valley. It's something you should always keep an eye on. All the biggies. And who bought Skype? Microsoft for $8 billion. And Facebook is now trying to use Skype in their offerings. Anyhow, this is a big, big deal. And again, think about those numbers, think about those projections, think about where this is going. Group video is a big deal. Now, the third thing I just want to think here is going down another generation, the millennial generation here, Zuckerberg, and just say that what he kind of opened up was essentially this social networking world, which we know. And again, just for the sake of putting a number on the table, Facebook is now up to 950 million people. It's actually close to 1 billion people. I mean, in terms of the world, when you talk about 1 billion people, there's like the Catholic Church, there's the Muslim kind of faith, and then there's Facebook, right? I mean, there's not China, or there's China and there's India, and then there's Facebook. I mean, billion is like a big number. And there's no peasants on Facebook, It's crazy. And they were adding about 700,000 a day. So anyhow, I just want to say big numbers, crazy things going on there. But what's interesting is, I would say it's not Facebook. They opened the way to this social networking. But the key thing is, and I'm a little bit biased on this, but I think Google Plus is the one to be watching here. And the reason is this, is they've actually roughly emulating what you can do in social networking through Facebook. They're integrating with that very powerful video kind of applications there. And ultimately, they're integrating it with their very intuitive Google Docs. What that means is you can now start to do very serious collaboration. And this is an innovation, so start thinking. What's that? Sorry.
That's all of us. That's all of us every day.
Okay, that's exactly right. Now, why is that important? And you guys are all the innovators, right? The Holy Grail, since these early wired days, is how do you get a physical meeting, everything you do in a physical meeting to be virtual? because that starts to get really interesting. And so we had all these basic attempts at, adding on to the phone conversations that, it's the messaging and all that kind of stuff. And then we basically got to a point where then we started all these biggies started to integrate these things and say, okay, well, can we get it all in one way? And then we had startups like Jive and all these trying to like integrate it and make it more and more and more. Google Plus is in this kind of continuum. What we're basically heading towards very shortly here is essentially this part where we get the virtual meeting being almost as complex, where you can do almost as sophisticated a work virtually as you can do physically. You still can't get the group hug and go drinking with your buddies after the playing. But this is not far off where that thing, 10 people around the table sharing documents, you can do very fluidly in a virtual world. And just to do one little thing, just a little break here, I just want to show this one thing. I don't know if you've seen this, but it kind of gives you a little glimpse where I can see where you can start to see where this aggregated video with a lot of people starts to really get interesting. And this is this guy, Eric Whitaker. I don't know if you've seen this, but he basically is a guy, a composer, who's basically used YouTube to audition people to sing in his choir. And he chooses them one-on-one, and then he basically gets them to do their piece, and then he aggregates, not in real time, while this is coming, he aggregates essentially the experience. I'll give you just one little clip of this just to see how he does it. It's kind of cool. I don't know if you've seen that, but he's actually done a few of these, and he's even got more. He got 2,000 people on one of these in one of his latest ones. And again, this isn't necessarily, but think how sophisticated that is. Think how the collaboration you have to have on that level. And this was done, again, one by one, just aggregating all these feeds. Google, it's been told, has been able to hold, I haven't confirmed this, but I've been told by people that I think is pretty reliable, that essentially they're able to hold internal Hangouts way beyond the 10 people, and they're actually able to get up to 100 people based on Google Hangouts. Now, you could see where you could lose some productivity on 100 people. How do you manage it? On the other hand, technologically, it's interesting that they're starting to push the boundaries of this. And so you're starting to see, like, this whole thing we could be doing virtually somehow down the road here. Again, depending on bandwidth and how we go. Anyhow, I just want to shift now quickly. There's a thing on technology. The second thing I want to just touch on, and these are going to be quicker ones, I just want to touch on this thing, the globalization of everything. Again, another world historic shift going on here, and things that it really does change everything. And so, and again, this is the arc of your career. You're going to have to redesign all these systems. So how do we really work globally on everything? And so just a couple little data points I want to say about this thing is, again, throwing some numbers here that some people might be familiar with. You kind of feel it in your bones, but you don't really see the numbers. It's worth reminding ourselves, because this is now back in your era here, is that only in the year 2000, oops, where's the number? Oh, we lost the bottom line here. Oh, I lost it. Anyhow, this is back in 2000, the turn of the century, the turn of this century. Basically, only 31% of people in North America were online. Let me think, Jesus, that was only 12 years ago, right? A third of our, and this was the rest of the world online. It really was, and as much as we talked about in the Bay Area here, it's like, oh man, we're all wired. It was not true. Now, what's happened in the last decade to 2010, those numbers really went up, and of course now we're close to 80% of the North America has it. But what's interesting is Middle East, right? They're back where we were, and hey, what's happened? They got the same tools, they got the same connectivity, and then you can see the whole region's up in flames, right? Anyhow, stuff happens. But this is where the world is. Well, it's getting more interesting than that, folks, because if you take just to look out in the next 10 years, here's the way to kind of think of what's happening here, is we've already got about a third of the planet, about 2 billion people, a little more than that, who are already online. So this is, think of it as a percentage, right? We've already got 75% of the planet on cell phones. Not online, but at least have the basic telecom connection through a cell phone, which is extraordinary. I mean, people literally 15, 20 years ago, basically nobody had cell phones. And now you got 75% of the world, including peasants in the middle of Africa with them, right? Well, it's not going to take long till everyone on the planet, barring a few kind of pockets, are going to have at least those little phones. And we know on the back of those phones, you can put the internet kind of just builds right on the back of those kind of telecom connections. And we know on the back of those connections, you can 3G, you're going to put 4G and full bandwidth. And so it's inevitable. Just bank on it that within the next 10 years, you're essentially going to have broadband connections to everybody on the planet. The Holy Grail, again, something we've talked about in the digital revolution since the early 90s. It's going to happen. It's there. Bank on it. So that's the world that we're going to have. Well, so, wow, you can open video connections to anybody on the planet in 10 years. Wow, you can do these collaborations that, right now we're just kind of doing in these elite little centers. Anyhow, it starts to get really interesting of what you can do. Now, it's not just tech, though, that's doing this global thing. I don't want to get too much into it because we don't have enough time, but I want to just stake out this. Since the collapse of the Cold War, which is basically here in the 80s, you've watched two things happen. One is the interconnection of the entire planet in the same one market, which is world historical. And the second thing is this incredible rise in democracy and this drop in autocracies, essentially. And again, the numbers are quite astounding. And we're still seeing it repercussions through the Middle East. But again, this is something that's really a shift. That's a big deal. Now, I want to talk about that integration from this big picture perspective, is because people are wringing their hands like, oh my God, what about this recession? And oh my God, the economy is still kind of juice, and what's going on here? From the point of view of essentially the global economy, we have just witnessed the greatest boom in the history, and we're kind of at the end of it, and we got a lot of running room ahead of us, of a fantastic boom ahead of us here too. Now here, let me just give you this sense. When you talk about long booms, the big economic expansions that have happened in the history of the world, they come from two main things. New technologies, which allow you to do totally new things and drive new economic activity, and integration, more and more tightly integrated markets. Barriers between countries falling, barriers between sectors falling. And so the classic one, which everyone kind of goes back to and says, oh my God, why can't we be like the good old World War II days, was what happened in World War II. But the thing is, what has happened since the World War II one, there's a total parallel to what's happened in our area here. And I just want to make this little thing here just to kind of give us this perspective like, oh my God, we're like that World War II crew. So one thing is, World War II ends, all the technologies that were developed in the war, which were mainframe computers, plastics, commercial aviation, atomic energy, all kinds of stuff, right, goes from the military side to the private sector. Tons of new things, we can build new things around, which is what they basically started to do. That's one. The second thing is we took half the world, the free world, integrated those economies of the Western economies, and we got this kind of integrated economy that kind of could spur growth. Those two things is the main reason why America boomed. Why America? We love technology. Two, we took advantage of, we loved the most open economy, so we took advantage of the integration. We had this boom going. By the 60s, the entire Western world was on fire. We all were booming, and it was only in the 70s when you got these oil shocks, which was the lifeblood of that industrial economy, and just quadrupled the prices of oil, that we essentially flamed out after about a 30-year run of incredibly robust growth, brought a lot of people around. So you think, oh my God, we look back and say, oh, those are the golden days. Not that different, frankly, what we've just lived through. And here's the thing what happened. The Cold War ends here in the 80s. The same two meta trends happen. One is all these new technologies developed by the military go into the private sector. Computer chips initially were designed to guide cruise missiles. The internet was designed to kind of communicate in nuclear war, right? Spy satellites, all these things, these GPS things are on now, that was all about looking into Russia, right? And kind of keeping an eye on their missile silos and stuff. It all goes into the private sector, and so then we start building these crazy companies on this stuff, right? That's one thing. The next thing is you took not just half the world, you took the entire world. Communist China, Communist Russia, this quasi kind of socialist India. You put them all in the same integrated kind of world economy. And of course, you got this incredible boom, conditions for a boom. And so who takes advantage of it the decade after that? America. Hey, we love tech. We're the most open economy. We go gangbusters. We had this crazy boom going in the 90s, right? Just wild going. We loved it, right? But this last decade where we kind of think in America was kind of slowish, it was a global boom. The entire global economy is on fire, folks. I mean, China, Brazil, you name it, Turkey, I mean, places all over the place, they're booming. They're still actually, although there's this pause, which we'll get to, crazy kind of growth going on. And ultimately, the question is, how do you manage that kind of growth? How do we make the transition to the next big updraft, which I'm arguing we're going to do, and that's through this kind of reinvention. Now, just to show you how this is going, all the metrics have to be global. Think about America in the context of we are just this kind of sector or this region in this global economy. And if you look at the global economy that way, it's been a wild ride. In fact, in terms of growth, since that post-war world, we've just been charting. And then when the communist countries start breaking down, boom, we're taking off. We're at a $61 trillion economy here, folks. Now, the more interesting thing is, because we're wringing our hands about, oh my God, poor America, we're screwed up. The U.S. has had 25% of the GDP of the world for the last 40 years. The last 40 years. The rise of China, all this stuff's going on. We still are essentially an extraordinarily big piece of the global economy, and we're going to be there for a while. And so we should stop getting all angst-ridden about, you know, how screwed up America is. Now, think about it this way. Think about the global economy as one integrated economy, and we're just playing a piece. Well, what piece are we playing? We're playing the innovative piece. The most innovative place in the country is the United States. Now, there's other pockets around, and I don't want to get too chauvinistic here, but I just think just cut through what's going on here. If you take all the really cutting-edge sectors, particularly tech, they're still very much rooted in the United States. Not completely, but definitely from a big picture point of view, it's like, wow. All these, I mean, Silicon Valley, there's nothing remotely like it in other parts of the world. I mean, Wall Street, you can talk about how their innovation has gotten us in trouble. Hollywood, there's nothing comparable yet. The American military is completely dominant. Aerospace, to this extent, is still pretty much dominant. Higher education, nobody, you know, people are coming here for education. They're not flocking to Beijing right now. Healthcare, same thing for the highest end thing, the innovative end. Innovative anything is happening here, and it's essentially a huge part of what's going on in this economy. And so what's happening is in a global economy, we're essentially having a lot of these innovation sectors are really at the top of this global economy. And so what's happening, again, just to kind of put this in context, the reason these tech companies are booming so much, look at the numbers here, folks. There's only 307 million people in America, right? In an average month, YouTube gets 800 million unique hits. That's, you know, more than, you know, way more than what's going on in this country. This is all the babies and the 90-year-olds too, right? So there's a ton of, obviously there. This is, you know, basically which one? This is the Facebook one. Actually, when we did this chart, they were there. Now they're up to 950 million a month. And Google is well over a billion unique hits on Google search engines and stuff. So I'm just trying to say, you always got to think in these global terms, and people kind of lose track of that all the time. Now, what is in the political reason, I'm going to end this little section here on this, is what's happened because of that is the people at the top of that pyramid are reaping these global profits, essentially. And so you're getting an extraordinary concentration of wealth at the very top. And it's not just kind of the oil barons like the Koch brothers that are I mean, it's these tech companies, all these folks, they're making extraordinary amounts of money because of that thing. They're sitting on the pyramids. They're essentially milking a billion people a month, all over the planet a month. So what's happened is you've watched wealth get concentrated. This is a percentage of essentially the upper 1% share of total income. It's essentially up to the upper 1%. It's up at the same levels it was up back here in the robber baron era, right? And so you're watching. This was the dip in the great kind of post-war boom, right? And so we're watching the same phenomena, which is why the politics is starting to react to this and say, wait a minute, this is getting out of whack, just like the politics react to it right here. And here's one little example of policy of how this plays in this, just to kind of give you one little example of that. This is the tax rate on incomes the top 1%, right? There was no tax. Like I remember I told you we established an income tax right here. And then it kind of went down in the 20s. We said, oh, let's get rid of that. And then it came back in the 30s. In the 50s, the booming 50s and 60s, the nominal tax rate was 91%, folks. 59. They were killing the 1%. Now, you know, it got too much and they started to bring it down, right? But this idea that, you know, we're killing the 1% here, that's kind of crazy. In historical terms, it's about as low as it was back in the early part of the year. I mean, this is the norm in historical terms of where. Now, I'm not saying we go back to 91%, but I'm saying this is what, there's some rationale, what's going on with this discussion of how do you rectify the country. It's at 35% now, and they want, you know, Romney wants to get to 20, just to put it, you know, which should be down where it was in 1928, which was, you know, what happened in 29, right? Anyhow, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I want to actually tee up some numbers that even you folks, I think it has to, you got to feel this in your bones. Because, you know, I don't have to convince you about climate change is happening. It's a huge problem. We've got to deal with this. But look at the immensity of the challenge we're up against. I think you really got to look at that. And so this is essentially, and this is information I'll tell you, just to give credit where credit's due, is by a guy named Saul Griffith, who I worked with in this next agenda, my last company, and he's an extraordinary innovator. He's got a cool little shop, about 20 engineers sitting over there in the Mission right now. And he is devising all kinds of new clean energy kind of devices. But anyhow, he came up with these charts. I just want to say that. What's interesting is if you take the snapshot of the entire world right now, energy consumption in a year, in terawatts, which is the biggest unit of energy we talk about, we consume about 18 terawatts of energy globally. And these are the sectors. You know, this is electricity coming off the grid, right? This is, you know, we think about, oh my God, cars are so bad. Yeah, they're bad, but that's just a section of it, you know? Heating and cooking essentially is a big section, you know, forestry is a big section, manufacturing. Anyhow, there's a lot of blame to go around. There's a lot of energy use going on in this planet, right? So that's where we're using energy, right? If you look by country, this is from the 70s onward, all energy use across the world has expanded. The U.S. has been pretty good about staying steady, although we're creeping up. This is China, this is India. The basic point here is we're using more energy and everybody's doing it, and these countries are starting to really start charting up, right? So that's bad. If you take essentially across the last century, this is essentially where our energy's been coming from, the sources. Blue essentially is carbon-based. This is coal, and the good news is we're about the same level of coal as we had in the beginning of the 19th century. We've migrated up to relatively cleaner natural gas. This is natural gas, and this is petroleum. But still, it's all carbon, folks. And this is the renewable space, which is gaining from where it was basically nothing here, but it is still dwarfed. And again, energy use itself is going off the charts, right? This is essentially global energy production. How does the whole world produce our energy? Coal, big chunk there. Oil, big chunk, unfortunately. Plants. I mean, this is like Africa and these places. They're still burning plants, right? That's, you know, this is climate change in, you know, high gear here, folks. But anyhow, just to point this out, this is nuclear and this is renewable. So the mix is I'm not going to swear, sorry. Oh, gosh. What the hell are we going to do? Well, somehow, and this is Saul Griffith's kind of calculations and brilliant thinking out of this, is we basically got to get out of that we got to get energy use down from 18 terawatts to maybe 16 terawatts and try to hold it there. And then even there, you essentially are going to have some fossil fuels. You're just not going to go away with it. But essentially the idea would be how could you get up to 11, close to 12%, 12 terawatts in clean energy as fast as you possibly can. Because the key thing here is we've got 2 degrees rising. We got enough room, scientists think, of 2 more degrees to rise in the global the atmosphere until we get to these feedback loops where the ice caps are gone totally and we start getting the kind of methane going out of the Siberian kind of marshes, and then it just gets into this thing where we can't even get a handle on it. So the point is, how do you keep it under 2? To get under 2, you got to go as fast as possible to this. This is a proposed, you know, within the next 25 years or so, you're going to have to somehow boost nuclear. This is something that drives a lot of progressive folks nutty, but you basically, it's a clean, from a point of view of climate change, is clean, and it's actually something you might have to think about for baseload. Anyhow, this is just a theoretical mix, but you got to do a huge build-out. Huge level of reinvention going on here just for the energy. And if you just take our grid, this is the basic electric grid of the United States right now. This is our mix currently, roughly currently. This is 2007. Still a ton of coal. This is inexcusable, basically. Natural gas is getting built out and replacing coal. This is this new clean coal, natural gas fields and the fracking and stuff that's going on. The only good side about that is that it will hopefully force out coal quicker than we thought. But even so, it's still carbon. And so this is something that we got to be shooting for in the next 30 years or so. Monumental challenge. Monumental challenge. And so let's do a little scream here, group scream. Anyhow, I'm going to turn the corner here a little bit as I look to my presentation here. Formal remarks coming up and give a little time for you guys to talk. Huge challenges, huge system shifts we have to do. Any one of these things to redesign, reinvent these systems would be, again, a 10, 20-year shot, right, of incredible dedication. And so to make that transition from this 20th to this 21st century, it's big. It's a big challenge. Now, that said, if you were to actually do that kind of fundamental innovation, that fundamental reinvention, what would you do? The first thing you'd look to is like, how could we take advantage of these technologies? These incredible technologies that I started the talk laying out to you, right? Well, there's three attributes of technology that's really useful to think about in this context. One is an incredible ability to scale. And the basic thing about scaling is, again, it's the basics of essentially the network effect, is that for an individual, all you have to do is invite two people, let's say. How hard can that be, right? Into a network, into some kind of group thing. And those two people only have to invite two more people, but the network itself expands exponentially, right? And then those two invite two, boom, the network goes out again exponentially. And then the next one goes out, boom. And then the next one goes out, boom, we're at the wall. And then we're at, boom, at the street, right? This is the kind of thing that gets Facebook to 1 billion people basically in the space of 8 years, right? But you can do an incredible lot of scaling up of amazing projects, not through some monumental effort of one guy, but through this incredible, just basic kind of network effect of people linking up around really interesting projects. So that's in our favor, right? The second thing is technology allows parallel processing. And there's a kind of lesson, if you think about this, these are kind of the server racks of essentially a Google server farm. And the way things work right now, it used to be in the old days, and I remember these days, the supercomputer was the fastest way to get anything done, and so you just had one brain made so super smart and big that it essentially could crunch any number. And then somebody figured out, hey, what if you did this? What if you took a problem and you broke it into smaller problems, and you parsed it out to smaller, less powerful computers with kind of telecommunications connecting them up, like fiber optics, and then you had everyone solve a part of the problem and then reassemble it to give you your answer. And that's essentially distributed computing. That's essentially parallel processing, and that's what basically these server farms do. You know, you basically ask a question to Google, it goes out to like into all kinds of different literal smaller computers, and they all go and it all happens in fiber optic kind of connections, and so it happens in 2 seconds or a second, or half a second. But it isn't one big brain. It's many, many, many brains working together. Now, there's a kind of a lesson there, which is you could basically take, in a way that in the old days, you know, you have to have one guy thinking about it or one think tank figuring this out, right? No, you can actually, with this scaling up, you can get way more people working on way more different things. And you could start to scale every, just solving clean energy, man. There's all these sub-things you got to solve. So there's a scaling factor that you can finally do with this technology that you could never have done even 10, 20 years ago, right? And the third one is this one I went in great lengths to lay out to you, is this video, is you can finally actually collapse space. You don't have to be in the same place. You can connect people up from all over the planet. And that's a huge deal, because it used to be you'd have to fly them into DC or get them into a conference for 3 days or whatever the heck it is. It's like, whoa! We can now actually start to connect people up all over the planet, and you can start to do things much more efficiently, much more thoroughly over time. Now, those 3 meta-trends things are something in a very small way I'm trying to take advantage of. We're trying to take advantage of. Matt here over here is a part of the team here. We're basically trying to take about this new company, Reinventors. And given that you're kind of a business crew, I want to give you just one little look here that fits into this larger frame of what's going on with Reinvention, of one small startup that's kind of trying to take one little whack at this thing and trying to take advantage of these technologies to make one little effort, essentially knocking this thing down. And that's this company, Reinventors, and we're basically starting out with a project, appropriately enough to reinvent America, starting this fall. We're basically going to be launching. We just incorporated. We're going to launch after the elections, and I'll tell you a little bit about this company. So the first thing is we're assuming, after I just laid out this, that the world is going through this really rare historic transformation. And we're assuming that essentially America is going to go through a fundamental reinvention. It certainly has to do that, but we're saying it's in fact in the beginning stage of doing that. And we're assuming that this isn't just the thing about America. This is happening all over the world. This is the people in Greece kind of trying to figure out how to, the euro problem. I mean, all these systems of the 20th century are breaking down. You name it, it's happening. Middle East, Europe, China, it's all not working. So we go, okay, we're taking that as a given. We're also taking it as like, for whatever reason, we can analyze this, that conversation that we really need isn't happening in our politics now. There's all these reasons for it. You can't make a misstep. There's every little cycle, news cycle, and you alienate these people, and you get hit by this and that. Anyhow, I'm just not going to blame it on an individual or anything. It's like our politics is the point where you cannot talk about that kind of level of innovation, that kind of level of kind of fundamental reinvention. Okay. We also think to have this conversation, you need to have the best innovators, the smartest people who understand technologies, they understand these fields of the future, they understand where the world's going. We want them to help us figure out how to reinvent these systems. We don't want some guy in a think tank. He's been in for 30 years in Washington. He's been talking to these politicians. Everything's cautious. Everything's kind of, it's something he learned at, Brookings Institute 30 years ago. Whatever. That's not who you want in this conversation. We need to get the folks that are essentially inventing the future anyhow. How to get them in this conversation. Well, we think essentially, and we also want to take advantage of why wouldn't we take advantage of this group video capability. The thing I just talked to you about, this powerful new capability, clearly on a trend to expand more. How can we take advantage of that thing to do this? And so what we're essentially doing with this project is we're creating that conversation, that missing conversation on how do we fundamentally reinvent America. We're connecting up those remarkable kind of reinventors, people, the kind of folks that understand tech, fields of the future, getting them to talk about this thing, and we're going to do it over this interactive group video. And that, in essence, is just the three things we're going to pull off. And we're going to do it starting this fall in this little pilot project. Now, in a practical way, how this would work is essentially, this is Michael Pollan, for folks that know him, one of the great thinkers on food. This is the kind of guy we're talking about as a reinventor. This is a guy who he's not sitting in Washington. He's not at the Brookings Institute. But if there's a guy who understands what do we need to do to fundamentally reinvent agriculture, how to fundamentally reinvent food production, and has some big ideas on how you'd actually pull that off or think about that in the next 20 years, we're going to have a guy like that anchor, essentially. Every part of our series is going to have an anchor reinventor like Michael. And we're going to ask him straight up, Michael, knowing what you know about this space, don't have to have the finished, polished idea. Throw out a big idea or two on how would you basically start to reinvent this space. Don't think about the constraints of politics and how you get it through politics, you get it voted on, or how you get it through committee or all that kind of stuff. Don't worry about if it's going to alienate the kind of ideology of one side or the other, that kind of thing. Just say, how do you know the 21st century is going to work, and what's your best shot at how we'd reinvent that system? In fact, that's going to start these things. This is a mock-up, by the way. This is not the way it's going to look, but that's me kind of driving that conversation. But what we're going to do is take advantage of this roundtable situation, this group video. And so this is a guy named John Battelle. You probably remember John was one of the founding managing editor of Wired Magazine, did the Web 2.0 conference that was really helped spread the idea of Web 2.0. Brilliant guy, interesting guy, knows a ton about media. Would love to have John help reinvent privacy. Okay, SOPA and all these different attempts that DC is trying to do about protecting intellectual property or privacy amongst people, that ain't working, right? Why don't we get the folks that understand the digital world, understand what it needs to do, and help them kind of reinvent, redesign these kind of new systems. So anyhow, this is an example of a guy who would essentially anchor that. And this is that Saul Griffith I was talking to you about, the innovator who came up with a lot of that other stuff. All three of these folks, by the way, are people we've approached. All three of those people have said they'd get involved. This is the kind of caliber of folks that we want to start getting to start to spike that conversation. But as we build in this roundtable, it's not just that Pollan's idea or Battelle's idea. It's like riff off other experts, riff off other people, innovators. Get these conversations moving through this group video, streaming it to live audiences, archiving it on the web through YouTube, actually. And ultimately, then the audience can build off those kind of catalytic conversations, and questions that emerge or things that emerge out of these initial conversations, we can actually have folks in the audience start to kind of build on those questions, answer those questions, participate in other kind of ways. There's a way that we get essentially, because it's not just the rock stars, and it's not just these kind of roundtable folks, the few people you can squeeze in for 10 people on a seat there, but ultimately we think there's a lot of people who contribute to this kind of reinvention. And ultimately, knowing the web now and how it actually moves, we've got a bunch of ideas of how to actually get these ideas out and certainly get it into the slots like in DC and other places that they can keep an eye on these real reinventors and these real fresh new ideas on how to do these things. We've got a bunch of folks. I mentioned to you some of the folks we got here. You might recognize some of them. A lot of them are in the Bay Area. A lot of the folks that you're probably familiar with. But they're folks that essentially haven't had that kind of, don't have that access to DC, aren't being asked what they do, and are essentially not applying their brains to civic innovation. And we think that this would be one avenue to do it, and we're actually finding as we reach out to these folks, they're more than happy to do it. They love to do it. They got kids. They got legacies. They want to basically help solve the problem. And we're finding a really great response from them. Your business crew, so I want to say we always got to think, and I've started other businesses too, how are you going to make this? How are you going to sustain this? Without going into super details here, we've thought a lot about this. And we've thought about, besides getting initial investment from the Valley, which we do have now, we've got one of the early guys from Facebook has essentially just put money into our company, so it's catalyzing the initial kind of investment. And so we are in the game, we're going from an investment point of view, but it's actually how do you sustain this thing? And what we basically think is that, that this conversation is a valuable conversation. And this access to these kind of folks is something that people would be really interested in being a part of. And so we do think amongst the round table of 10 people that would be in these conversations, we'd reserve a couple slots for sponsors. And we've already talked to a certain number of folks from companies and kind of high net worth folks that even do it, but particularly companies who would like to be associated with that kind of innovation, but also would like that kind of access to this conversation and like to be in on that table, seat at the table, and we're finding out people actually do that. Now, if you do it that way, if we can crack this model of catalyzing these conversations, bringing this kind of things to spark these kind of early thinking around these kind of reinventions, we think it actually could actually scale up. Because if you could get sponsors doing, if you can start to get conversations around reinventing America across all these fields, you could start doing it in Europe. We're already starting to talk to a person in Europe who could actually anchor one of those. If you could go into different areas, you could reinvent education, you could reinvent kind of energy. So basically what we're doing, think of it as a media show catalyzed around this basic framework of reinvention, kind of catalyzing the conversation, building up the network, and essentially creating a media product that hopefully will spark a lot of new thinking in these spaces. Now, that's a little company thing. We can talk a little bit about that in the Q&A. But I want to finish the talk here by bringing it back to where we started in politics here, and winding up the talk. I think Obama's going to win, and I think it's going to be actually more substantial than people think. And I do think it's certainly, I think the Dems are going to hold the Senate, and I do think it's possible, even though people don't think about it, but I think it's possible that the Dems might take back the House. Even if they don't do that, there's going to be a message in this election, I think, about this choice, which is getting teed up, and I think there will be a sense that we're starting to turn the corner a little bit on this discussion. This is my, I'm an optimist, so we'll see. My own politics coming out here a little bit here, but I do think this is actually a pretty decent call, I would say, is going to happen. But what is really the mistake that Americans have made, and I hope you folks don't make it, is that politics for the 20th century politics is looking up at the great leader and thinking that great leader's got to solve all the problems, right? And at the very least, who he appoints in his cabinet has got to solve the problems. That is so 20th century, folks. That is just so not the way the world works, right? It's like Obama, I mean, how can he figure out all this stuff, right? It's just impossible, right? You got to think about it from his point of view. He's looking at him looking out. It's up to us. I mean, he's kind of said that, and he's been kind of mocked a little bit or joked about it, and it's about this election about us. It's totally the right call, folks. It's like the only way we're going to solve this kind of fundamental reinvention, the only way this is going to happen is if it's essentially a much more bottom-up kind of phenomenon that goes through all these different fields. Now, to think about, we think, oh my God, okay, now it's up to us. How are we going to pull this off? I'm going to end this thing just with one last analogy, because I talked about the last analogy was the early 20th century, the progressive era. The most recent transformation of this scale we went through was what happened after the Great Depression and basically World War II. And that's even more instructive. And I think it's actually kind of inspiring in a way because it actually gives us a sense of like how we could pull this off. The last time this happened of this scale, essentially these folks had their same crazy unprecedented challenges, right? They had, in fact, you really got to say the Great Depression was worse by far than what we had in our Great Recession, their Great Depression. But they had their, terrorist threats. We're talking about terrorist threats. They had Hitler. They had fascism going on. They had basic communism, nuclear war. Nuclear war was their climate change. They had no idea how to stop nuclear war. They were convinced we were going to get nuked to pieces. I grew up, I'm old enough to grow up. I was growing up like, getting under desks in grade school waiting for the bomb to come, right? It was, you guys don't remember that because we've kind of forgotten that. But that was their climate change freak out, right? But in fact, they basically did what you got to do. There's two things. You can take the technologies you got at hand and your human resources at that period of history, and you got to say, we're going to do the best we can. And so what they did is this is literally the kind of inner circle of FDR's crew. This is Vannevar Bush here, who was the chief scientist of FDR's chief scientist. He's the guy that is kind of credited with the first guy to really envision the World Wide Web in a classic piece. There's a classic piece you can go back and find on this. But anyhow, the point is, there's a bunch of kind of old white dudes with chalk, trying to figure this plan out, right? And in fact, and again, this is just to remind us, the tools of their time were these, typewriter, they had typewriters. And again, just to remind us how far women have come in this time, the women's role, half of our population didn't get to think about how to solve this. They just got to type out the orders and send it down the road, right? So, it was, that was only 60 years ago, right? But anyhow, they did their best, what they had at the time. And essentially what they did in an extraordinary short period of time, folks, basically space of about 15 years, they came up with a completely new way of economics called Keynesian economics, which at the time was radically different, and in fact now might be not the solution as we debate things, but still was an incredible innovation at the time, and they put it through and they pulled out. They basically solved the kind of security problem, defeated fascism, contained communism, figured out how to basically get that nuclear balance going. There hasn't been one nuclear bomb problem in the last 60 years. That was unthinkable back then. They were certain there was at least going to be certain collateral damage in different scenes. It worked, in other words. They built in the space of 3 years entirely new institutions. Basically, the United Nations, World Bank, IMF happened within 3 years. Whole cloth. Let's just do new ways to coordinate globally or internationally at their time. And they did things like kind of the GI Bill, and they had the FDIC mortgages, and they had Social Security, all these different things that essentially grew this kind of middle class. Anyhow, I'm not saying this is what we would do, but the point is, in the space of literally about 15 years, they came with an explosion of innovation, what I would call reinvention, and essentially they created the world that we're living in still to this day. And now we look back on it and we go, oh my God, they were fucking amazing. Look at FDR. He's in the history books, right? But you know what? Back at that time, when they were starting this thing, they had no idea. So, I would argue, despite kind of, oh my God, we voted for change 4 years ago and it didn't come. Folks, we are in a thing that's going to be, it's not about the 2008 election. It's not about the 2012 election. It's going to be the 2016 election. It's going to be the 2020 election. We're going to be banging at this in 2024. This is a world historical transformation. This is building a kind of new kind of civilization. This is essentially an all digital, all global, sustainable civilization. It's never been done. We don't know how to do it. It's going to take time. That's the way to think about what we're doing here. Luckily, if you took stock of our technologies and our human resources, we've got an incredible array of reinventors, of innovators. These guys, they aren't going anyplace. Zuckerberg, he's got 60 years ahead of him, right? The Google guys, they got juice for about 40 more years, right? This is like, they're not going anyplace. And these are just the tip of the iceberg. Tons of folks of this caliber, right? If you take even just, in the broader sense, anybody with a college education, compared to what happened in the World War II, there was less than 5% of Americans had a college education. It's now about 30%. In real numbers, it's essentially, we've got 86 million compared to their little piddly 5.6 billion. It's 15 times as many. Now that college-educated people are the only people that kind of value, but I'm just saying, wow, wouldn't you rather have 15 times as many educated people kind of to pull off your reinvention? But the thing that's even more crazy is, could you imagine if you basically would have walked in to FDR and said, hey, I got this thing here that if you basically, you can ask it any question in the world, and you can get all the world's information back prioritized to you in a second. He would have looked at you like, you got to be nuts. That's just crazy. It's magic. But of course, it's Google, and like everybody has it. Like 5-year-olds know how to work it, right? I mean, it's extraordinary, powerful tools in historical terms. And so basically, I would say we have everything we need to make this transition, this reinvention. And I would argue that people in 50 or 100, and I would say even 200 years from now, they'll be looking back and they'll say, huh, it was interesting. It was that early part of the 21st century, and the world was facing up against these really crazy challenges. They were making this very different world, but they figured out a way to redesign all their systems to work in this new digital environment, interconnected, computerized everything, and they redesigned all their systems around that. They figured out a way to kind of completely redesign the planet to work on this kind of global planetary scale in ways that had never been contemplated before, and they figured it out pretty well. And they redesigned all their energy systems, all their kind of consumer items, all their kind of building materials, all their kind of city designs, and they basically figured out a sustainable way to basically work on a planet of about 9 billion people, and they basically turned the corner on climate change. They're going to say, wow. They're going to look back on that time and say, that was an amazing period of history. That wasn't just a kind of interesting part of American history. That was like one of the most fundamentally core periods of reinvention in the history of that country, and ultimately in essentially the history of the world. And if that sounds crazy, just hold that thought, and when you're about to pull that lever in your voting, or when you're talking politics with your buddies, in the next 2 months here, keep in mind this framework and think, you know what? That guy just might be right. And with that, I'm going to say thank you, folks. And this is that company we're just launching. It's a little splash page right now on the web, so it's not much there. But like I say, in the next couple of months, you're going to see a lot more coming out of this. So anyhow, Nathan laid out a bunch of ideas there. I don't know. Does anyone have any thoughts on pushback or reaction or? Do you need interns? We actually probably will. In fact, particularly with someone with business savvy like your folks here. So happy to do that. Yeah, my email's right here. You can basically do that. I mean, we're just getting started, so we got a ways to go. But anyhow, here's a question.
So one of the things you had on there was nuclear power had to be about 30% or something of where energy needed to be. Japan just yesterday, 2 days ago, said that they're going to cancel their nuclear program by 2030. So they were, or maybe still are, one of the leaders in nuclear energy production. I'd love to get to the 30%. One of the biggest sources of it has been offline for most part for a while and is planning to completely shut down. So I know you're looking at it from a macro point of view. I'd love to kind of your point of view and kind of what that discrepancy is. This a bump? Are we going to expect somebody else? Are we right now don't seem to be on a great path to actually fill in the gap there. So I'd love your thoughts on that.
Well, look, I mean, I threw that up as a goal or an idea, or it's just a rough way. I mean, there's a million ways to get to some kind of decarbonize the energy systems, and that's just one way. I mean, the one thing about nuclear, which, your generation is great. From my point of view, you guys are open-minded, you're kind of flexible, you're thinking, about the big picture. I mean, particularly people in this kind of program, you're not the problem. Actually, the boomers really are the boomers are the problem in many respects, which is my generation. And hopefully they're fading out more and more here. But because there's just such fierce, the thing about boomers is they just have such fierce passions about everything, and they just won't let go. And so this is why we have these culture wars over and over and over again. I mean, how many times can we fight the Vietnam War thing again? We're doing it again with Romney and the whole thing. So anyhow, it's like, But this nuclear war, the nuclear thing is part of this issue that it's just baked in from this kind of 60s, 70s kind of period that, you know, nuclear is bad, it's a bad thing. But it isn't, really. I mean, it's got its issues, but, you know, a lot of stuff has issues. And climate change getting out of control is going to have way more issues than, you know, the danger around what are we going to do, you know, if Fukushima, you know, has this or that, or to what extent, you know, what are we going to do with the you know, the radioactive waste. I mean, those are not problems that you shouldn't, you know, we shouldn't be concerned about or we shouldn't be aware of. But I think what we got to do is adapt this big picture thing. I do think there's a next generation of small nukes that are starting to get built here. And in fact, there's stuff here at Lawrence Livermore. Labs are doing a ton of stuff around this. And for those that actually are into this space and actually want to open their minds a little bit about this, one of the great environmental thinkers of the Bay Area forever has been a guy named Stuart Brand. And he was, you know, part of the Whole Earth Catalog guy. He started that and was totally anti-nuke kind of guy for a long time. He's really done his rethinking on that, and he's really now much more bullish on we have to basically do that to bring CO2 down, and he's kind of lays out a bunch of things on that and how we could do that. And it's not just these big, you know, kind of centric, you know, kind of quasi-military installation things that we've kind of built in the 50s and, you know, coming off the war, that was the way people thought, big, lumbering, huge things. I think the next generation of nukes will be much smaller, and they'll be much more decentralized, and there'll be ways that essentially they'll be safer. And there'll also be ways, there's been some creative ways of how to do it with the waste. So anyhow, I don't have all the answers on that. I'm just thinking, just like everything here, we got to think so much more flexibly. We got to let go of past prejudices. We got to basically open our minds to things that we hadn't thought about, and we got to take risks. And you know, we're going to have to take some risks, I think, around nuclear energy. The biggest threat here, as long as we're talking about energy, I didn't want to get into it, but I will just tee up, is like, this whole opening now up of natural gas and new oil fields and stuff going on in this country, it's really a complicated situation here. And I don't want to get too deep into it here, but it is an issue that I would really tune into here, folks, because what's happening is natural gas there's much more abundant and much more available now than we thought, even 2 years ago or 3 years ago. And there's actually a little booms going around this, extracting it now, which is adding to the economy and getting people all excited. And it is some positive side of this, which is, I've literally heard this from people who are really tied into, you know, essentially the carbon industries, that a lot of coal-based plants that 2 or 3 or 4 years ago were getting planned and just, damn the torpedoes, they're going to build these coal plants, are getting shelved for the idea that there's going to be a next generation of cleaner natural gas kind of plants, which are by far much better than coal, which is the dirtiest and the worst kind of carbon, but still is not clean energy. And essentially, you're building essentially yet another generation or two of, you know, these natural gas plants. So anyhow, this is an issue that I think you got to tune into. Now, I don't think you have to slab the brakes out here. There's some kind of transition where we're going to probably get to cleaner and cleaner carbon energy for a while we parallel process to try to get much cheaper kind of scaling up clean energy, but it's a big, complicated problem here, and it's one of the great challenges of our time, I'd say. A couple other questions?
So why don't you put someone like John F. Kennedy in one of those sort of fundamental shifts? I mean, the reason I ask is I think about knowledge workers, right, and actually a move away from actual work in many cases, right, going out in the fields or road, you know, surveyors and construction, and a lot of that actually seems to be sort of, you know, headed the way to the dinosaurs, and we have a lot more knowledge workers and maybe too many in some cases. So I wonder why you don't put someone like John F. Kennedy in that same fundamental shift, with a shift away from actual labor, after the Great Depression with FDR, to a different kind of labor, computers and people wanting to work for NASA and so forth. Did people hear that? Do we have to repeat that? It's just kind of, you know, he was just asking why wouldn't John F. Kennedy and the kind of contributions that Kennedy made to shifting the economy and shifting our society kind of put him in that kind of category of reinventors, essentially, or shifting the country. I mean, there's a little bit of an arbitrariness. Everyone has their own slicing and dicing about where they see the real junctures in American history. I would say I'd put Kennedy in the kind of Reagan kind of category of a pretty big shift, but not as fundamental as a reinvention. I mean, Reagan, you know, shifted the politics of the country into a more conservative politics, but essentially in terms of reinvention,
there were no real fundamentally new institutions. There were no kind of completely new whole cloth kind of initiatives. There was just, hey, let's cut back the regulations, let's cut the taxes, let's, it was kind of taking the existing system and trying to kind of tighten it up and clean it up and reinvigorate it. And so, which is kind of what the conservative response is to essentially problems in the society, is essentially go back, just do them better. And you're seeing it coming out in this election right now. It's like they're not criticizing the fundamental approach of, that small government kind of free market cut taxes thing, but they're just saying we didn't do it hard enough last time under Bush. We didn't go deep enough. We didn't pare it back enough. And that's a very classic conservative response. It's just like, do the old thing, but just do it better. And, and that's coherent and that makes sense, from a kind of rational point of view. I just don't think it fits in these periods of reinvention. The systems that we have to build are so fundamentally different. They're not, we just can't, and this is, it's also to kind of go at the Democrats too. I want to be clear about this. The Democrats do not have all the ideas by any means. In fact, what they're doing essentially is saying, let's hang on to Social Security. Let's hang on to Medicare. Don't touch it. That's as boneheaded as, cutting everything to the bone thing too. That's not really a good solution. But I do think, and so that's as much a part of the problem. What we need is the next generation of ideas, and I think my only point is that I feel, and again, there's room for debate here on what everyone might feel, but I think Obama has the core values, he has the right direction, and he essentially has the smarts to kind of adapt. He really wants to go, let's say, for example, you don't have to convince him that there's climate change, right? You don't have to convince him, about these basics of where the world's going. And I think he wants to go there more, in fact, he's been able to do in the last 4 years. And so I think, but does he have the answer of how would you do this whole suite of new things that have to do to fundamentally reinvent the country? Absolutely not. But I think that's where that's where the ideas have to come next. Go ahead. There's someone right there too.
So I don't think anyone's going to argue with the awesomeness of the concept of having these interactive video chats with these really innovative, exciting people. But how are you going to grow it beyond TED, for example, or beyond to really make that change to reach people who will then do something about these really big ideas, especially, like you were saying, not to consider the feasibleness of the ideas that people are presenting? So if they're doing these crazy big idea things that are probably beyond the scope of what many people can imagine, how is that going to translate into a broader change?
Terrific question. It's something we wrestle with a lot. I mean, again, it's like every company or every effort is, you got to bite off a piece of what you can kind of do. And so we're starting, and we're a small little company, and we're trying to figure out what's the really missing piece that we can actually help do in a quick way. And one of the things we feel, or I feel, in founding the company, was that the biggest missing piece right now in terms of the broader political situation we're talking about, in the broadest sense, is we don't have enough concrete sets of transformative ideas that really are up to the scale of the problem and are actually in tune with essentially the new realities of the 21st century. And that everything going forward, it's going to be all digital, it's going to be all interconnected, it's going to be all global, and it's got to be sustainable. And what's happening is a lot of the ideas that we're addressing in Washington or in California here or in these kind of even city governments a lot of times, they're still too trapped in these old paradigms, and they're still incrementally trying to nudge the thing up from what we've already been doing. And so I think, and I've actually been in this game for a while. In 2004 to 2008, I didn't really lay this out for you, but from 2004 to 2008, I essentially left my private sector job at Global Business Network, founded a thing called the New Politics Institute, and I worked with people in Washington to try to transition them to the new way of doing politics on the internet. So for example, I got really into the fabric of how do you use Facebook, YouTube, text messaging to do politics. It wove into the Obama campaign. And full disclosure, I was part of his technology and media advisory committee, and I was, very much in that sector, right? And I came out of 2008 thinking, this is great. We kind of now got a new set in Washington. Let's go into this next generation of ideas. But there just really weren't a lot of them. And so what was happening was we were teeing up these same old ideas. I mean, the economic ideas were the same old kind of Geithner and, ideas that were kind of the same. It was a kind of democratic twist on the old kind of Bush, kind of conservative stuff. And then, but even across the board, a lot of the big ideas were not there. Now, there were some genuinely new and big and fresh ideas that they tried to do, and in fact, they were accomplished quite a bit, including moving, healthcare and other things which are, were really difficult things to move, and I think in historical terms will be seen as big accomplishments. But I would say, in terms of a ton of next generation, 21st century ideas, they just weren't there. And so, and it wasn't also coming from the think tanks. It wasn't like there was a lot of fresh things. They were just kind of dusting off the stuff they did in the Carter and the Clinton era, and they were kind of moving it up into like, hey, this is the 2009 version of what I showed Clinton, we didn't quite get it through. Anyhow, so too much of that. And so I think what I wanted to do is, and meanwhile, I'm living in this Bay Area for the last 20 years, and it's just exploding with amazing people, and they're totally rethinking everything, and they're completely not hemmed in by the old stuff, and they're thinking big and transformative, and they kind of looking out 10, 20 years, and it's like, get those people talking about these things, getting them talking to Washington, get this stuff kind of, let them imagine where to go, and let the kind of people in D.C. just kind of figure out the details and the legislation and how does it work and how do we actually institute it. But crack the nut of the big idea with the kind of thinkers that essentially we've been used to out here, who have cracked the big ideas on how to reinvent the economy and how to reinvent media and how to reinvent, all the things we're kind of experiencing now. And so that's the kind of, so our little small swing at that is get those folks to start those conversations, get people catalyzed around that, the round table, including people from Washington. In that round table, we're going to have people inside the Beltway coming into that thing, riffing off of Pollen and saying, hey, but we tried something similar and the farm bill, it didn't work. So it's not like keep those people totally out of it. Have them riff in part of that conversation. And if I can catalyze and we can catalyze through this enough of those conversations, that's going to be an accomplishment, and I think a relatively significant accomplishment. And then it goes on to your generation, your kind of next implications. Like, well, then how do you get those things to really move, and how does it really scale up, and how do you get more people involved? And those are things we're wrestling with, and without getting too into the details, it's the next generation of problems we're going to have to worry with. Hopefully that'll be our problem in a year or two once we get solving it up on our feet. Anyhow, there's one in the back here. I don't know how many more can we pretty much. Okay, I'm cool with that as long as you guys are. I don't want to keep you guys from the bar or wherever you're going next. Huh? Okay, there's a guy on the way back there and who's been waving his hand.
You've been talking about reinventing America, and a lot of the examples that you gave is about America being at the spearhead of reinvention along history, right? But now we're talking about global problems, right, that affect everyone around the whole world, and there are a lot of smart people coming from not just America, right? What about the rest of the world? You did talk about reinventing Europe, like reinvent Europe, but I felt like you were just talking about America, right? What about the rest of the world?
Totally get the global thing, and I will say, I am American. I'm living in America. I think America is in a particularly potent juncture right now, and so that's where my living and breathing and my examples and what I know and what my life has been about. So it's kind of where I kind of come from, and that's where I talk about. But clearly, my intellectual framework and my kind of understanding of how the world works is absolutely. There's tons of other places that are doing incredible invention and reinvention and innovation. I guess if I just had to say it, though, I would say, and again, in an hour conversation, you're trying to basically move things fast. I will say that Americans, without being too chauvinistic, I would hope, one thing Americans are really good at is innovation. It's kind of something like built into the fabric of the culture or the kind of personality of the country. It's kind of just something that, the idols from the earliest days of Ben Franklin and, Edison and, Ford and, Steve Jobs, all these icons that we think about. There's this lionizing of the out-of-the-box thinker. There's this kind of, our schools celebrate the creative kind of thinker. instead of, and I lived in Asia for a while, for example, and, the educational systems there are really essentially promote much more memorization and much more kind of lecture for, taking the information from the top down. And the American kind of system is kind of like, try your own idea and celebrate things and be the rebel. And, anyhow, the whole Hollywood celebrates that whole thing. Anyhow, there's this whole thing that permeates the culture that really is more conducive to innovation. Try to do things and try to experiment things and be the individual breaking the new mold or thinking outside the box, all that stuff. And so I would just say, if you had to think about the global context in this juncture of history, and you just say you beam down from another planet, and you're kind of just roaming around saying, like, where would you go to try to figure out where would the innovation, most fundamental innovation probably coming from? People would tend to maybe point you to, well, you should probably check America. That's kind of the crazy wacko folks that like to rethink things all the time. And if you got into America, they'd kind of point you, well, you should probably go to California. That's kind of the wackiest end of things. And then if they got in California, they'd say, well, you should probably go up to the Bay Area. And in fact, this is, if you really have to get down to it, kind of a collection. And it's also an open, diverse place, more so than most places on the planet. So we welcome crazy other out-of-the-box thinkers from all over the world, right? I mean, but that doesn't happen in a lot of cultures. Japan and other places, they're not welcoming people from other countries, or China, for example, or different places I've been, or even European countries are more resistant to outsiders. So anyhow, there's a kind of just a mix, a stew, a culture, a kind of a zeitgeist that is not a bad place to start. That said, it's not the only place it's happening. It's happening all over. And I think what you're going to see in the next 10 or 20 years, it's going to be a global phenom. It's going to go all over. It's happening. I think this reinvention thing, I do think it's going to see more of it faster here, but I think it's going to be something that you'll see happening all over the place soon. And, I do not think, I'll just say it, I do not think that the U.S. is going to fade out and be this kind of ho-hum thing and not really be in the center of this kind of reinvention, and that it's all going to be about China or it's all going to be about someplace else. And there are people talking like that. I just think that's crazy. I just don't think it matches with the facts. I don't think it looks at the big picture history. It doesn't understand the culture. It doesn't see it. I'll give you one little example of that is, for example, I just had a conversation with two Americans who were living in China, and they were running private schools geared to Western expatriates there. And they were essentially just recently asked by the Chinese government, asked these folks to essentially leave their jobs and actually start essentially internal in China, Chinese schools around the kind of basically American, but a kind of Western model, but American model. And the reason is because they actually realize that even though the Chinese test scores are beating the pants off the Americans, and even though, the kind of memorization of math and science stuff is happening, they understand they're not breeding essentially an innovative culture. They're not getting that kind of fundamental reinvention and entrepreneurial kind of new things that essentially are the things that are essentially going to drive the next generation of big companies. And I defy anybody here to, I bet you couldn't name one, maybe let alone three Chinese companies of real innovation that are really driving global innovation. And you could, and we get it, they're littered around here in just the Bay Area here. So I'm just saying, what I'm saying is the Chinese recognize that. And so I think there's something, there is something that's going on there that I think is worth thinking about. Again, not trying to be chauvinistic, but just trying to be accurate and just trying to think, okay, what's the truth? Where would you go for innovation? I would say here, and in other places too. Anyhow, I hope they didn't offend too many people. Maybe, I don't know, that was a long, maybe one more, yeah, because that was a long conversation. All right.
It's kind of like a two-part question about execution. And the first question is, how do you set the agenda for each of these roundtable discussions? And second is, how are you planning to actually build this platform? Are you going to build it on top of someone else's platform, or are you actually going to build this global network from scratch?
The basic way I would like it to go, first of all, I'm going to be essentially the interviewer to start out, and over time as we scale up, there will always be an anchor, moderator, interviewer that could kind of drive the conversation, because we want to lower the bar. Unlike TED, someone mentioned, we don't want to have people have to super prepare and have a ton of thinking and polish everything. This is more like, hey, lower the bar, come into our conversation. If you do a little prep on it and some thinking beforehand of what you'd like to throw out as a big idea, particularly once the show gets up and running, people get what it is. It's like, oh, cool, I'll do a little thinking. I'll scratch out a couple ideas, come in. But if not, I'm going to basically be able to interview them essentially to pop that out. I was a long-time journalist at, for Newsweek and anyhow, a bunch of different places. So I've kind of used to that whole thing. But anyhow, so that's kind of a sense of doing that. And the agenda, but though ideally the agenda is theirs, but if not, we'll push them into a kind of framework to get their best idea out. The second thing he was asking was the, sorry, what was it? The technical platform. The great example of that. I'll tell you what, my last company, Next Agenda, which I founded 4 years ago. We ran it for 4 years. We just wound down that company. After 4 years, it's a good, solid little business, but essentially it wasn't scaling or doing the thing we wanted to do, and we wanted to do something more impactful, so we wound it out to try this new one. But anyhow, that company did try to build a platform. And we basically lost our shirt trying to raise money and put money into it, and it just got to be this sinkhole. And we also were watching meanwhile, Google and these other people are building these platforms that are like, how the hell can you keep up with that? So I've learned that lesson, which is the great thing all you should take to heart, which is failure is honored in Silicon Valley and in the Bay Area. It's thought of as a badge of honor because you actually learn a lot in these failures, and I learned that, which is I'm not going to build another platform. And so basically we're building on another platform. Initially, we're basically going to build it on Google+. We're going to build it with the Hangouts there. We've been talking to them, and essentially we're going to build our collaborative platform using their essentially core things. And then, of course, we'll have our own website, our own web environment. And it sounds like you guys are all over Google+, but I will say in the last 2 months, Google+ has come up with a ton of new things. They're essentially live streaming it now to live audiences you can do. You automatically archives those things. It's now got an iPad app, which is terrific using the video. And they are throwing, I was just down there about 6 weeks ago, and they said they are throwing resources at this. It is a huge priority for the company. It's early days, they were saying. Just think of this as early days in Google+. There's going to be a lot more to come. So hang on for that ride, and definitely tune into that if you haven't yet. And with that, I'm going to let you go. You've been a great audience, great questions. Good luck. Good luck in your careers, and love to stay connected. And stay in touch. Watch the show.